The rain had been falling for hours, relentless and cold, drenching the city and turning the riverbank roads into winding streams of mud. Thunder cracked across the sky like nature's fury answering a man's darkest deed. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that follows when the world holds its breath. But amidst this storm, one man stood unmoved, as if untouched by the chaos around him. Elliot Vance adjusted the collar of his designer trench coat, his expensive leather shoes squelching in the soaked earth as he stepped closer to the edge of the river. In his arms, he carried a sleek black case, reinforced and custom-made, airtight, watertight, with interior padding and small, nearly invisible air vents. A brutal masterpiece of engineering. Inside, nestled in soft blankets, were two newborns, his sons. They were no more than 3 days old. Helpless, beautiful, innocent, and Elliot was about to erase them. His driver, Ronan, stood behind him, silent and unreadable. The two men had shared years of history, but tonight, Ronan kept his eyes averted, refusing to meet Elliot's gaze. This was the kind of act that chained itself to the soul. Ronan didn't want to see it, didn't want to remember it later. Elliot didn't care. Lightning flared, revealing the dark waves of the river ahead. Swollen, angry, moving with a speed that promised finality. The perfect place for secrets to vanish. He hadn't always been this man. 18 years ago, Elliot Vance had been a struggling entrepreneur, clawing his way up in a ruthless business world. He had charm, intelligence, and an unrelenting hunger to rise. But ambition, when left unchecked, becomes a monster with an insatiable appetite. And Elliot had fed his monster with everything. Relationships, honesty, even love. Especially love. Her name had been Lydia. A bright, radiant light in his life during those early, hungry years. They had met in college, built dreams together. She believed in him when no one else did. She'd supported him through bankruptcies, sleepless nights, and business failures. But when his big break finally came, the merger with Strathfield Tech that catapulted him into elite society, Lydia didn't fit anymore. She was messy. Real. A reminder of the struggle. He married Vanessa instead, a cold, polished woman from an old money family. Strategic, impressive on paper, emotionless in practice. She tolerated Elliot's indiscretions as long as they didn't interfere with their image. For years that worked, until Lydia called. She was crying, angry, and pregnant, with twins. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice raw. "I just want you to know. I'm going to raise them. You don't have to be involved, but I won't hide them." That terrified him more than anything else had in his life. Not the board of directors, not the media, not the ruthless deals. This. 2 living, breathing pieces of truth that could burn his perfect empire to the ground. She wasn't bluffing. 2 months before their birth, photos of Lydia had begun surfacing on gossip sites. A woman with his features, a belly unmistakably swollen, whispers of scandal. He met her one last time, at a quiet cafe near the outskirts of town. She looked tired, hopeful, naive. "You can still be part of their lives," she said. "They'll know you. They'll love you." Elliot had smiled. He held her hand, promised to call. That night, he paid a doctor to falsify medical records and shift Lydia's delivery to a private, off-the-books clinic. He had her moved under the guise of better care. The next morning, she was gone. The official report said childbirth complications. No one asked questions. But the twins had survived, an oversight, a costly one. And tonight, he was fixing that mistake. The box in his arms felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The babies were quiet, likely still under the mild sedative the nurse had administered at the clinic before they were taken. He hadn't looked at them since. Couldn't. Wouldn't. They didn't have names. They weren't people. They were threats. He stepped to the water's edge. "Sir," Ronan said quietly behind him, unsure, but unwilling to stop him. Elliot didn't respond. He thought of Lydia. How she'd looked the day he told her he couldn't be involved. How her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. How she'd held her stomach protectively, like she knew even then that danger was coming. A bolt of lightning split the sky. Thunder answered. Elliot closed his eyes and let go. The box splashed into the river with a soft thud. It floated for a second, then began to sink, slowly, methodically, as if even the river didn't want to rush what was happening. Gone. He turned without a word, brushing past Ronan and sliding into the back seat of the waiting car. As the door clicked shut, the silence inside felt suffocating. But he didn't look back. Not once. He had board meetings in the morning, a product launch next week, a new offshore account to set up. His life was waiting. But the river was not done. Beneath the surface, the box struck a submerged log. The impact wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. A seam loosened, just slightly. A sliver of river water seeped in, but so did something else. Air. A critical bubble formed, shifting the box's descent. Instead of sinking deeper into the abyss, it drifted sideways, caught in a strange meandering current, carried away from the city, from Elliot's world, and into someone else's. Miles away, as dawn began to smear the sky with bruised light, a woman named Mabel Rowe stood on the porch of her cabin, tucked deep in the woods near the water's edge. She was making tea, listening to the slow chirp of returning birds. Her husband, Nolan, was already out back checking traps. Life was simple here, quiet, predictable, until she heard the crying. At first, she thought it was an animal, a fox maybe, or a raccoon. But as she stepped down toward the river, the sound sharpened. Fragile, human, desperate. And then she saw it, the box wedged against a crooked tree limb in the shallow water. She called for Nolan, heart racing, feet splashing through the muddy bank. Together, they hauled it ashore, pried it open with trembling fingers. And there they were. 2 infants, alive, pale, but breathing. Mabel burst into tears. Nolan wrapped one in his flannel jacket. The other she held against her chest, feeling the tiniest heartbeat thrum against her skin. They didn't know who these babies were, or where they had come from, or why fate had chosen their little cabin as the end of one man's secret and the beginning of something extraordinary. But one thing was certain. They weren't alone anymore. And their story was just beginning. The sun had barely broken through the dense mist that clung to the river valley like an old ghost when Mabel Rowe walked into the sheriff's office holding one baby in her arms, the other wrapped in Nolan's wool hunting coat. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying all night, not just from shock, but from something deeper, a pull, a knowing. She didn't understand why, but from the moment she held the twin boys against her chest, she felt like the universe had delivered them directly into her soul. Sheriff Carter James looked up from his desk, mid-sip of bitter coffee, his brows knitting together at the sight before him. "Mabel," he asked slowly, setting the mug down. "What in the name of?" "They were in the river, Carter," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "In a box, a sealed case. It was floating. We almost didn't see it." She turned, letting the small bundle shift slightly so he could see the pale, soft face of the child inside. Carter's jaw tightened. They were left to die. He stood up quickly, gesturing to his deputy. "Get Doc Halpern down here now. And call Child Protective Services. We've got a situation." As the office shifted into quiet chaos, phones ringing, voices rising, boots scuffing against the old wood floor, Mabel found herself standing still, watching the faces of strangers turn pale at the sight of the twins. Everyone around her seemed to see a tragedy, a crime. But Mabel saw something else entirely. Hope. Nolan had barely spoken on the drive over. Not out of indifference. No, his silence was heavy with thought. The way a man chews on something in his mind before deciding to speak it out loud. He had placed a protective hand over the baby lying on the back seat, checking every few seconds to make sure he was still breathing. There was a look in his eyes that Mabel hadn't seen in years, not since they lost their own son, Jamie, at just 4 months old. That grief had cracked them in ways only the silence of the woods ever truly witnessed. Later that morning, a social worker named Ruth Cassidy arrived. She was kind but stern, a woman hardened by years of witnessing what most people couldn't stomach: abuse, neglect, abandonment. She took the babies in her arms carefully, cataloging their condition in clinical terms: underweight, signs of mild sedation, no visible bruises, umbilical stumps still intact, less than a week old, most likely. "Do you have any idea who they might belong to?" she asked. Mabel shook her head, but then hesitated. The box, it was custom, expensive, airtight. Whoever did this didn't want them found, but didn't want them to drown right away either. It was almost like they wanted a small chance, like they didn't have the heart to kill them outright. Ruth looked at her, surprised. "You think this was mercy?" "I think it was cowardice," Mabel replied softly, her voice bitter around the edges. News spread quickly. By noon, reporters had already begun sniffing around. River twins, they were calling them on the morning radio. Speculations ran wild. Drug dealers abandoning a lover's children, a desperate teen mother, a cult. None of it made sense. Nothing added up. There were no missing baby reports in the region. No DNA matches in the state system. No one claimed them. They were ghosts with beating hearts. And in the middle of it all, Elliot Vance sat in his sleek office on the 58th floor of the Stratfield Tower, surrounded by glass and steel, completely unaware that the news reports would soon reach him. At that moment, he was sipping imported espresso, discussing European expansion strategies with a board of cutthroat executives, all dressed in matching suits like corporate soldiers. A man so consumed with wealth and image that he hadn't even thought about the river since that night. To him, it was over, dealt with, forgotten. But fate doesn't forget. Later that afternoon, a junior associate named Hannah walked into Elliot's office with a nervous look. She held a manila folder and an iPad in her hands. "Sir, you asked to be alerted about any unusual press activity involving children or hospitals in the tri-state area." He turned slowly, setting his pen down. "Yes. There was a discovery this morning. 2 infants were found in a floating case on the Rivermark stretch. Alive. No identification. It's all over the local news now." Something flickered behind Elliot's eyes, a twitch, barely perceptible. "Do we know who found them?" "A couple. Nolan and Mabel Rowe. They live off-grid, no children of their own. But here's the interesting part." She turned the iPad around. A paused news clip showed Mabel holding one of the babies, wrapped in a familiar blue blanket. One of the blankets Lydia had kept from her pregnancy. Homemade, quilted with tiny embroidered stars. Elliot's stomach dropped. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window, and stared out over the city skyline like he could will this problem away with enough distance. But the truth was closing in. What was supposed to disappear had surfaced. Literally. He couldn't afford this. Not now. Not with the IPO looming. Not with Vanessa's family watching every move. He turned to Hannah, voice cool and even. "Keep eyes on it. Quietly. No action unless I say. Understand?" "Yes, sir." But the wheels were already turning. Back at the cabin, Mabel rocked one of the boys gently in the old wooden chair near the fire. CPS had agreed to let the twins remain with her and Nolan temporarily under emergency foster care, just for a few days, they said. Just until something more permanent was arranged. But Mabel could already feel the bond stitching itself into place. She hadn't asked for this, but some part of her knew she'd been waiting for it all along. Nolan was quiet again that evening. He watched her from the doorway, arms folded, his face lined with thoughts he hadn't spoken. "You're thinking it too," she said softly, not turning around. He nodded. "They're not just babies," he whispered. "They're ours now. I don't care what any paper says. Mabel finally looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. Then let's fight for them. Because while Elliot Vance thought the river had buried his mistake, what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that those boys were never meant to drown. They were meant to live, to rise, to find their place in the world. And maybe, just maybe, to expose the man who tried to erase them. The days blurred together as the weeks passed, but Mabel never allowed herself to stop thinking about the twins. She found herself awake in the dark hours of the morning, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with an overwhelming sense of purpose. She could sense that the twins were more than just the innocent victims of a terrible act. They were the key to something much larger, a secret buried so deep it had yet to surface. The weeks that followed their arrival were a whirlwind of legal procedures, social workers, and an unrelenting investigation into the river's mystery. It wasn't long before the local news stations picked up on the story. The twins were dubbed the River Babies, and the mystery of their origins became a topic of rampant speculation. Everyone wanted to know who would do such a thing. But no one had any answers. No one could even begin to comprehend what had happened. Mabel and Nolan's cabin, though remote, became a focal point for the town. Neighbors came by, bringing food, clothes, and toys, all offering their support. The twins had captured the hearts of everyone who heard their story. But Mabel knew this was just the calm before the storm. Sheriff Carter James had been digging into the case with a quiet determination, following every lead, no matter how small. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. And right now, Mabel knew he was the only person who could uncover the truth. It wasn't long before Carter came knocking on their door one evening, a grim look on his face. "Mabel, Nolan, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. They led him into the small kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Nolan poured coffee, his hand steady despite the tension in the room. Carter's eyes flicked to the twins, who were sleeping soundly in their crib, a peaceful image, yet it was the calm before the inevitable storm. "I've been digging," Carter began, sitting down at the table, "and I found something. There's a man who might be involved in this, and I'm not sure how deep this goes, but it's bad, real bad." Mabel felt a chill run down her spine. She had already sensed that there was more to the story than just a random act of cruelty. She leaned forward, her heart racing. "Who is it, Sheriff? Who did this?" Carter hesitated, glancing out the window as if making sure no one was listening. "Victor Hale." The name sent a jolt through her. She'd never heard it before, but the way Carter said it, with such weight, made her feel as if she'd stumbled into something dangerous. Nolan put down his coffee cup, eyes narrowing. "Victor Hale?" he asked, his voice cold. "Who's that?" "A millionaire businessman," Carter said, "big player in the financial world. He owns half the city's luxury properties, has a family, the whole shebang. He's been clean for years. But I've got sources telling me that something shady is going on behind the scenes. We've had whispers about him for years, but nothing concrete. Until now." Mabel's mind raced. A millionaire? How could someone with so much wealth and power be involved in something like this? And why? What possible reason could there be for throwing two innocent newborns into a river? She felt a surge of anger rise within her, followed by a deep sense of dread. Carter continued, "The twins, they were his. I don't have the full story yet, but I know he's been keeping a lot of secrets. His wife, Alina, she was doing some digging. I think she found out something she wasn't supposed to. And these two, they might be the result of something he wanted to keep buried. I don't know yet, but we're going to find out. I'm going to get more on him, but it's going to take time, and we have to be careful." Mabel could feel the weight of the words settling over her like a heavy fog. This wasn't just about saving the twins anymore. This was about exposing a man whose secrets could destroy lives. Secrets that could destroy the twins' lives. What are we supposed to do with them now? Mabel whispered, looking down at the two innocent faces sleeping peacefully in the crib. Carter sighed. "We do what we've been doing, Mabel. We protect them. And we wait. The truth will come out, one way or another." As he left, Mabel stood by the window, staring out into the deepening twilight. The world felt colder somehow, as if the safety they had found in their small cabin had been stripped away. She wanted to shield the twins from the ugliness of the world outside, but she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with them. The next few days passed in a blur. Sheriff Carter worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering information, but the more he uncovered, the more questions arose. Who was Victor Hale really? What kind of man would throw away his own children without a second thought? Mabel couldn't stop thinking about the night the twins had been abandoned in the river. The way the box had sunk so effortlessly into the water, as if it was meant to disappear without a trace. Whoever had done this had been meticulous, calculating, cold. There was no room for mistakes. And yet, here they were. The twins had survived. They had made it to the shore, against all odds. The story of the twins began to spread beyond the town. News outlets from across the state arrived, eager to capture the heartbreaking tale of abandonment and survival. But the more Mabel saw of the media circus, the more she hated it. She wasn't trying to make a spectacle of the twins' survival. She wasn't looking for attention. She just wanted to protect them, to give them a chance at a better life, away from the shadows of their past. But the truth was out there now, and there was no hiding from it. Mabel's thoughts turned to Victor Hale. If he was the one behind all of this, what kind of man was he? A wealthy businessman with everything to lose, willing to sacrifice his own children to keep his secrets. It didn't make sense. But then again, Mabel had learned long ago that the world didn't make sense. And as the days passed, it became clear that she and Nolan had been pulled into something much larger than they could have ever imagined. The twins were no longer just victims. They were the key to exposing a dark, twisted secret that had been buried for far too long. And as much as Mabel wanted to protect them from the pain of the past, she knew that the only way forward was to face it head-on. The river had brought the twins to safety, but now they had a long road ahead of them. A road that would lead them straight into the heart of the storm. The storm had subsided, but the silence that followed felt even more ominous than the raging rain. Mabel spent the following days alternating between moments of fear and resolve, unsure of what would happen next. Sheriff Carter had warned her that Victor Hale was a powerful man, and that any attempt to expose him would not come without consequences. But the more Mabel thought about it, the more she realized that there was no turning back. The twins had been abandoned for a reason, and she couldn't allow their suffering to remain a secret. Each time she looked at them, she saw more than just fragile infants. She saw resilience, a story that had yet to be told, and a future that was in her hands. Nolan was the rock she leaned on, as calm and steadfast as always, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting tension. His quiet resolve was slowly turning into an urgency, a realization that time was not on their side. A week after Sheriff Carter had first mentioned Victor Hale, Mabel sat alone on the back porch, watching the light fade from the sky. The twins were asleep inside, wrapped in blankets that smelled like fresh laundry. The house felt too small, too confined for the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had spent every waking moment wondering how she could protect them from the inevitable storm that was coming. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only delaying the inevitable. The phone call came late that evening, its shrill ring cutting through the quiet air like a gunshot. Mabel's heart lurched as she rushed to the receiver, her mind racing with possibilities. It was Sheriff Carter. His voice was tense, urgent. "Mabel, it's happening." "Is it about Victor?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Yes," he replied. "We've confirmed it. Victor Hale is behind the twins. And I've got some bad news." Mabel's stomach clenched. What kind of bad news? "There's a team of people looking for them. He's hired private investigators, and he's using his resources to try and track them down. You need to get them out of there." I don't know how much time we've got." Fear shot through her like a cold wind. How do we escape? Where can we go? Sheriff Carter paused for a moment. "I've got a safe house up north. It's isolated, off the grid. It's your best chance." Mabel's mind raced as she looked over at Nolan, who had come into the room, his expression worried. She nodded silently to him, signaling that they needed to prepare. There was no time for hesitation, no time to second-guess their decisions. She could feel the walls closing in around them, but she couldn't let herself panic. Not now. "We'll pack our things and leave as soon as possible," Mabel said, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. Sheriff Carter's voice softened, but his words were no less serious. "Be careful. This is bigger than you think. You're not just running from Victor. You're running from everything he represents. This whole town is in his pocket. If you get caught, it won't just be the twins in danger. It'll be you, too." Mabel thanked him and hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. She turned to Nolan, who had already started moving toward the closet, grabbing the essentials. There was no plan, no destination beyond the safe house. They were running, and running fast. They packed their things quickly, gathering only the necessities: clothes, food, and a few important documents. The twins remained asleep, oblivious to the danger that loomed over them. Nolan lifted the twins into the car, carefully placing them in their car seats, his expression grim but determined. The wheels of their old truck crunched against the gravel as they pulled away from the cabin, the world outside a blur of trees and fading daylight. Mabel felt a pang of loss as the familiar landscape slipped out of view. This had been their home, their sanctuary. And now, it was no longer safe. The quiet town they had come to love was now a place of danger, a place that would never be the same for them again. As the truck sped down the winding road, Mabel's mind raced. She thought of the twins, so fragile, so young. They had already been through more than anyone should ever endure. And now, they were on the run, with nothing but each other to rely on. The weight of her responsibility was overwhelming, but it also fueled her determination. She couldn't let them down. She couldn't fail them. Hours passed as they drove north, the landscape changing as they left behind the familiar and entered unknown territory. The safe house was located in a remote area, surrounded by thick woods and mountains. Mabel had only been there once before, but she trusted Sheriff Carter. It was their only option, and it was the best chance they had. They arrived late at night, the house nestled among towering trees, its windows dark and uninviting. Mabel felt a strange sense of foreboding as they pulled into the gravel driveway. The place was isolated, too isolated, but that was what made it safe. For now. Nolan shut off the engine, and they sat in silence for a moment, the sound of their breathing the only noise breaking the stillness. Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this wasn't just a safe house. It was a place where secrets were buried, where people disappeared. "Do you think we're safe here?" Mabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nolan hesitated. "I hope so. But I don't know. I just don't know." The door creaked open, and Sheriff Carter stepped into view, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "Come inside," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." They followed him into the house, the wooden floors creaking under their weight. The air inside was stale, and the shadows seemed to stretch long into the corners of the room. Carter led them to a small back room, where a table was covered in papers, maps, and photographs. "This is where we'll make our stand," he said, gesturing to the table. "We need to figure out our next move, and fast." Mabel felt a surge of anxiety wash over her as she looked at the documents. This wasn't just about running anymore. They were entering a war they hadn't chosen, but they had no choice. And no matter how much she wanted to protect the twins, she knew the only way to truly keep them safe was to fight back. Victor Hale wasn't just a man. They were up against a system, a network of power that stretched far beyond what they could see. But Mabel's resolve only grew stronger in the face of that realization. She would fight, no matter the cost. She would protect the twins, no matter what. And as the night deepened around them, Mabel knew this was just the beginning. The storm was far from over. Days blurred into nights, and the urgency of their situation only grew. Mabel's hands trembled as she tried to organize the papers Sheriff Carter had left with them in the back room. Maps, photographs, and phone numbers were scattered across the worn table, each piece a puzzle they needed to solve before Victor Hale's reach extended too far. Nolan was pacing in the corner, his eyes scanning the papers and his mind clearly at work, even if his face remained unreadable. It had always been like this with him, calm on the surface but driven beneath, always thinking, always calculating. She trusted him. But even Nolan had moments where the weight of their circumstances seemed to close in around him. "How long do you think we have?" Mabel asked, her voice barely a whisper as she glanced up at him. The twins were sleeping in a small crib they had set up beside the room, their soft breathing the only peaceful sound in the otherwise tense atmosphere. Nolan sighed, rubbing his temples as though trying to ward off the headache building in his skull. "We don't have long. Sheriff Carter's sources are saying that Victor's already narrowed down the area. If we stay here too long, it's only a matter of time before he finds us." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. Victor Hale, the man who had tried to erase the twins from existence, was close, and there was nowhere left to hide. It was as though she could feel his presence creeping closer, a shadow that hovered just outside the window, just beyond the trees. The feeling was suffocating, yet the only thing she could do was keep moving forward, keep trying to protect the twins, to find a way to survive. Her mind raced as she turned the papers over in her hands. She couldn't ignore the reality of what Victor Hale had done, nor the force he would use to get what he wanted. Mabel had no illusions about the man's power. The brief conversations with Sheriff Carter had given her a glimpse into the vast network of people Victor had under his thumb. Business deals, political influence, and connections that reached into every corner of their lives. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a god in his own right, with the power to make people disappear without a trace. And here she was, standing in his shadow, trying to protect two children whose only crime had been existing in a world that didn't want them. She stood and walked over to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their branches dancing in the evening light. The river that had once been a place of refuge now felt like a prison. The world was closing in around them. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, Victor would always be one step behind. She could feel it in her bones, and she could feel it in her heart, too. The looming threat that kept her awake at night, a whisper in the dark that said it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. "You're not giving up, are you?" Nolan's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She turned to face him, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. "I don't know what else to do, Nolan. I can't keep running. I won't." Nolan stepped toward her, his face softening. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure this out together. But we need to think smart, to stay ahead of Victor." Mabel nodded, wiping away the tears she hadn't realized had fallen down her cheek. She had to be strong, for the twins, for Nolan, and for herself. She couldn't let fear dictate their next move. She couldn't let the past define them. The sound of a phone ringing startled them both, and Mabel's heart skipped a beat. Sheriff Carter's name appeared on the screen, and she quickly answered, her pulse racing. "Mabel," Sheriff Carter's voice crackled through the line. "You need to leave. Now. Victor's men are closer than we thought." Panic gripped her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you mean? How close are they?" "They're about a day's drive away," he replied. "They've been scouring the area, and it's only a matter of time before they start getting closer. You need to get the twins out of there." Mabel swallowed hard. The reality of their situation was sinking in. There was no safe place anymore. Not here, not anywhere. "Where do we go?" "There's a cabin, an old friend of mine, a former officer. He's out of the picture now, but he's got a place off the grid. It's deep in the mountains, hard to find, and you'll be safe there. I've already made arrangements." Mabel didn't hesitate. "We'll leave tonight. Thank you, Sheriff. We won't let you down." She hung up the phone and turned to Nolan, her mind already shifting into overdrive. They didn't have time to waste. They couldn't risk staying another night in the safe house. She looked at the twins, still sleeping soundly despite the chaos swirling around them. They were so innocent, so unaware of the world that had tried to swallow them whole. She promised herself that she would keep them safe, no matter what it took. "Get the truck ready," she said to Nolan, her voice firm and steady. "We're leaving." Nolan nodded, his face set in determination. "I'll get the essentials packed." They moved quickly, gathering what they needed: clothes, food, and a few more important documents. Mabel could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. This was it. There was no turning back. As they packed, she stole a moment to look at the twins, her heart swelling with both love and fear. They were the reason she was fighting. They were the reason she would not back down. No matter how dark the road ahead became, she would never stop fighting for them. Not for a second. By the time they loaded everything into the truck, the sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. Mabel could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment they had been dreading, the moment they would leave behind everything familiar and enter the unknown. She didn't know where they would go next or what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She would never let Victor Hale take away the one thing that mattered most, the future of her children. As Nolan started the engine and pulled away from the cabin, Mabel looked back at the place that had been their home, their refuge. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel safe anymore. But one thing was clear: Victor Hale had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated them, and now they were going to make sure he would never forget it. The road was long and winding, each turn in the darkness like a sharp breath drawn in hesitation. Mabel sat in the front seat, her hands gripping the edge of the seat as the truck rumbled down the mountain path. The sound of the tires on the gravel road was the only thing breaking the silence that had fallen over them. Nolan, beside her, drove with steady precision, his eyes scanning the road ahead, but his mind clearly elsewhere. It had been a long day, too long, and yet they couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to rest. Every passing moment felt like the calm before a storm, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. Behind them, the twins slept soundly, their soft breathing coming from the back seat. Mabel kept her eyes on them, feeling the unspoken promise in her heart. She would do anything to keep them safe. They had already lost so much, and now they were on the run, fleeing from a man who was capable of destroying everything they had ever known. But she wasn't afraid anymore. If anything, the fear had transformed into something sharper, something far more dangerous: determination. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed. The trees grew denser, the shadows deeper, and the air colder. It felt like the world was pressing in on them. And each mile that passed, Mabel felt the walls closing in. But there was something else, something in the way Nolan was driving, in the set of his jaw, in the tightness of his grip on the steering wheel. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. It was the moment Mabel realized they weren't just running anymore. They were fighting. Nolan's voice broke the quiet, low and steady. "We'll be there soon." Mabel nodded, though she didn't take her eyes off the road ahead. She trusted Nolan more than anyone else. He was the calm in the storm, the one who could see things clearly when everything else was clouded by fear and uncertainty. But there was something different about tonight. Something in his eyes told her he wasn't just worried about the danger they were running from. He was preparing for the worst, and she didn't know how to feel about that. When the truck finally reached the cabin, the first thing Mabel noticed was how isolated it was, surrounded by towering trees and a thick fog that seemed to hang low to the ground. It was almost impossible to see the cabin until they were almost on top of it. The old wooden structure looked abandoned, its shutters hanging crooked and the front door barely clinging to its hinges. It was exactly the kind of place that could hide someone in plain sight, and it was perfect for them. For now. Nolan killed the engine, and they sat in silence for a moment, letting the stillness of the mountains settle over them. Mabel looked at the twins, still peacefully sleeping in the back, and felt a pang in her chest. How could something so pure, so innocent, be the reason for all this madness? How could they have ever deserved this kind of life? She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't just their protector anymore. She was their lifeline. Nolan's hand on her shoulder startled her, and she looked up to see him watching her, his expression unreadable. "You're thinking too much," he said quietly. Mabel let out a small laugh, though it was edged with tension. "I guess I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But you can't carry it all on your own. We're in this together, always." His words, simple and honest, were a comfort. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it, to believe that together they could overcome whatever was coming. They gathered the twins from the back seat and stepped out into the cold night air. The sound of the wind rustling the trees was the only noise, and the world seemed to have quieted, as if holding its breath. The air smelled of pine and earth, fresh and sharp. It was peaceful here, but Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that it was only temporary. As they approached the cabin, Nolan reached for the door, pushing it open with ease, revealing the dimly lit interior. The warmth of the fire inside hit them immediately, and Mabel sighed in relief. It felt like a sanctuary, if only for a moment. They stepped inside, and the door creaked closed behind them, with a finality that felt like the shutting of a chapter. The interior was simple, yet functional. A small wood stove crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The furniture was sparse: 2 armchairs, a small table, and a bookshelf filled with worn novels. But what stood out was the sense of solitude that hung in the air. This was a place meant for retreat, for escaping the world. And that's exactly what they needed: escape. Nolan quickly set to work, unloading their belongings and setting up a small cot for the twins in the corner. Mabel helped as best she could, though her mind kept drifting to the phone call she had received earlier from Sheriff Carter. It had been brief but urgent. Victor's men were closing in faster than expected, and Carter had warned them to move even further into the mountains if they hoped to stay hidden. It was a reminder of how fragile their position was. She glanced at Nolan, who was busy making a fire in the stove, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was putting on a brave face, but Mabel could see the strain in his shoulders, the way his hands moved with purpose but no ease. The man was doing everything in his power to protect them, and yet the shadows of their past seemed to grow longer by the day. Mabel approached him slowly, placing a hand on his arm. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment they shared a quiet understanding. They didn't need to speak to know the stakes had never been higher. "We'll be okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but full of conviction. "We'll make it through this." Nolan didn't reply at first, but his eyes softened, and for the first time in days, Mabel saw something like hope flicker in his gaze. It was a quiet thing, fragile but real. And in that moment, she believed it too. Outside, the wind howled louder, the storm beginning to pick up again. But inside, in the warmth of the cabin, they were safe, for now. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, they had each other. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.